right, well, there are about 50 folks that joined in, ready to go. So I think we can go ahead and get started right away. Does that sound good, LaToya, Ron?
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm an urban planner with RHI, and I'm serving as project manager for the Cville Plans Together process. And we're glad you're here, whether you've been involved previously in the last year or if this is your first meeting. If you go to the next slide, Ron. Oh, actually, excuse me. Speaking of Ron, let me please introduce Ron. We've got, I'm not the only member of the consultant team on the line tonight, so I'd like to invite Ron and LaToya to briefly introduce themselves.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Ron Sessoms, and I'm an urban planner with RHI.
And good evening, I'm LaToya Thomas. I'm the principal and founder of Brick and Story, which is the community engagement firm that is working in partnership with RHI. I see a question in the Q&A, what is RHI?
Yep. Yes,
so
happy to explain that. Good question. RHI is a consulting firm. We're landscape architects, urban designers, and urban planners. We are based in Alexandria, Virginia, but we've been working in Charlottesville for several years on a variety of projects. And this is our most recent project we're partnering with the city and community on. So thank you for asking that. All right, so if you go to the next slide, just a quick reminder for those of you who have maybe not been involved yet with Cville Plans Together. Cville Plans Together is the name of a process. And as part of that process, there are a few specific outcomes. First of all, we worked with the community to develop a set of recommendations for an affordable housing plan. That's part of the comprehensive plan. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. The current step we're in is the second step to update the comprehensive plan fully, incorporating the recommendations from the affordable housing plan, as well as other updates, including the future land use map, which is a primary thing we'll discuss tonight. And then once the revised comprehensive plan is updated, we'll be working with the community to rewrite the zoning ordinance to make sure that it reflects the goals and strategies outlined in the comprehensive plan, including the affordable housing strategies, and of course, the updated land use vision. So again, we're glad you're here. This is meant to be a really a process where the community can be actively involved. And so we're happy you're here to be involved. On the next slide, you can see what we're going to talk through tonight. I won't dwell here too long, but I'll note that you can submit questions as you wish anytime throughout the presentation. We will not generally be stopping to answer all questions as they come in. We may answer a couple clarifying questions as they come in, but otherwise we'll be holding most questions until we get to the end. You can submit questions and comments, and we'll get through as many as we can, and we'll follow up with those we may not be able to get to today. If you go to the next slide, throughout the presentation, we'll have two polls. One of them will be right now. We'll have one later, but first, we'd like to ask you to respond to a poll that should pop up in your Zoom window. And I'll invite LaToya to bring that up. We want to ask where you live. And unfortunately, Zoom requires us to keep it to 10 options. So that's why we've grouped different neighborhoods here. So you might have to search a little bit. They're generally grouped by sort of area within the city. If you don't live in the city, there's an option to say, not applicable. I do not live in Charlottesville at the bottom there. So I'll give you all a second to take a look at that. All right, looks like it's slowed down a little bit. Looks like we've got some folks from throughout the city. I'll show you the results here. So throughout this process, this month in particular, we'll be looking to reach out to folks in all the neighborhoods in the city. So it's good to help us get a sense of who we're hearing from. So thank you again. Let's see, if you go to the next slide, please, Ron. To get us started with the real content for tonight, I'd like to first briefly give a project update to let you know where we're at. So here is our current schedule. For those of you who have been involved in the project since we started, you know that the schedule has shifted a bit as we've gone. There were some initial delays due to COVID, of course, and some shifting in the affordable housing plan schedule and whatnot. So we'll continue to update the schedule as needed, but right now this is our current timeline. You can see the green bar is items related to the affordable housing plan. The dark blue bar is related to the comprehensive plan. And then the light blue bar is related to the forthcoming zoning rewrite. In these 3 pink boxes, they're numbered in sort of the key steps we've taken since we last met. So if you look down at the bottom left, you can see a box pointing to an area that indicates that one of the first things we did after we last met was that we summarized what we heard in fall 2020. At that point, we were getting feedback on the draft affordable housing plan, as well as some initial revisions to the comprehensive plan, including guiding principles and vision statements. And I'll talk more about those in a second. The next thing we did after we met with you last was that we then revised the affordable housing plan based on the feedback we got. And we discussed the draft with Planning Commission and then with Council. And then we brought a final version to Council and they endorsed the plan on March 1st. So we can see the final affordable housing plan on our website. And we really appreciate all the community feedback that made that a really strong document. We'll reference it several times tonight to show you how we're pulling that into the comprehensive plan.
Jenny, there's one quick question that in the Q&A that might be relevant. Can you give a high-level overview or a summary of what a comprehensive plan is?
Yes, I will do that shortly. So I will punt that for a couple of slides forward if you don't mind. But good question. The third thing we did was what we're talking about tonight, which is that after we had Council endorse the comprehensive plan, or excuse me, the affordable housing plan, we then began revising the comprehensive plan accordingly to incorporate the affordable housing plan recommendations and also to incorporate feedback we got on the guiding principles and vision statements, which are sort of guiding statements for the entire document and for the chapters. And we developed specific goals and strategies for those different chapters to say, you know, this is how we think we can reach the vision statements we define with the community. So we are coming out to you today and this month to talk about those goals and strategies in the comprehensive plan, and as well as the future land use map. And those are what we're talking about tonight. So if you go to the next slide, please. So again, to respond to the question we just got, which again is a good question, if you go to the next slide, I'll start out before we jump into saying how we changed the comprehensive plan or how we've updated it. I want to step back and give an overview of what the comprehensive plan is. So in a nutshell, the comprehensive plan is a document that describes and illustrates community goals for the future and guides decision making for various matters, including land use and development, transportation, economic development, etc. Once this document is adopted, it is a statement of the city's intentions and policies regarding land use and development. In order for the land use and design policies and guidelines to be truly effective, they must be reflected in the zoning ordinance. And so that's why after the comprehensive plan update process, we're going to move forward to the zoning rewrite. The current comprehensive plan that's in place is from 2013, and Virginia requires that municipalities look at their comprehensive plans every 5 years to look for potential updates. And so Planning Commission began to look at that in 2017 and 2018 and had a lot of different community discussions. And then it was put on pause for a bit, and then we have been brought on to work with the city to continue and finalize these updates with a real focus on housing affordability and equity. So that is overall what the comprehensive plan is. If you go to the next slide, you can see these guiding principles. And so we've mentioned kind of what the comprehensive plan is. It covers a variety of topics. As you'll see on the next slide when we get there, there are 7 chapters in the plan. And they all contain a variety of goals and strategies for the future to reach these vision statements that we talked about in the fall. And so one thing we have done is propose these guiding principles. And these are, what you see here is just sort of the headline for each of these guiding principles. There's a bit more text with them if you look on the website. But in general, these are principles that apply to the entire plan. These are different priorities for the community that we drafted and then reviewed with the community, with you all, based on what we heard from you. And so when you look at the chapters that we've provided on the website, you'll see that for each goal that's in a chapter, it identifies which of these guiding principles it addresses or can help to address. And so this is a way where we're showing you that we can connect these chapters together. They don't need to be separated into different topics. They can work together to achieve the same priorities. If you go to the next slide, you can see I mentioned there are 7 chapters that are listed here on these bullets. On the website, we've posted the draft updates to these chapters. Most of these chapters, we were working from draft updates from the 2017-2018 process that the Planning Commission went through, but with a couple notable exceptions. The biggest, I think, being the community engagement and collaboration chapter. It's listed last here in the bullets, but that doesn't mean it's the least important. It's very important, and it's a new chapter of the plan. So I'd invite you to really dig into that one, as well as all of the others. But for each of these chapters, if you look at how they're drafted on the website, you'll see again, on this graphic on the right, there are guiding principles that are called out throughout the chapters. But in general, each chapter has sort of 3 different components. There's a chapter vision statement, which lays out what we've defined with the community's help as the overall future outcome for each topic. So for housing, for transportation, et cetera, each of them has a statement of what we think the future of Charlottesville should be, based on what we've heard from you. Under that vision statement, there's a set of goals, usually somewhere between 8 and 11 for each chapter, and they are specific outcomes related to the vision. Under each of those goals is where you'll see how the guiding principles are connected. And then underneath each of those goals, there's several strategies to work toward each goal. And so each of the strategies will come together in a final chapter, which will outline the implementation strategy for the future. So that chapter has not been drafted yet because we want to come out to you first to get your feedback on the goals and strategies. If you go to the next slide, we obviously can't walk through all of the chapter updates with you in a meeting such as this and a webinar. So what we've done is provided an overview of some of the major updates. And I should note, these slides are posted on the website, and that is cvilleplans-together.com. And if you want to get right there, you can put /engage3. And I can put that link in the chat in just a second. But I want to run through just a few of these major updates, but I'll invite you to, take a look at, oh, thank you, Latoya just posted the link in the chat. I'll invite you to, review as much of the chapters as you want, but I know some of you may have specific topic areas that are of most interest, and I invite you to really dig into them. We've posted PDF and Word versions of the chapters on the website. But just at a high level to go through some of these, I mentioned there's a new community engagement and collaboration chapter. We heard a lot about this throughout the process. And some of the major recommendations of that chapter are to create standardized processes for community engagement, to actively seek representative and inclusive community input, working with community groups and residents who have their own networks that they can bring people to each process, and then using a variety of strategies for engagement. And these are things that we've also tried to incorporate into this process. With the next line, you'll see land use, urban form, and historic and cultural preservation. And this is actually a combination of 2 chapters from the previous comprehensive plan. There was a land use chapter and a historic preservation and urban design chapter, and we've combined them into one chapter because there's a lot of overlap between land use, urban design, historic preservation, especially in Charlottesville. So we wanted to provide a better way for describing some of the overlap between those topics. So as part of this chapter, we are providing a draft future land use map. That's a big feature of that chapter that we'll discuss with you in just a minute. There's also strategies in that chapter for ensuring that the implementation of the map is tied to equity and affordability, which again are some of the key priorities of this process. The chapter also supports a mix of uses throughout the city and increased housing options. And as part of that, it recognizes the role that historic properties not only have in the city in general, but the role that they can play in the housing conversation. With the housing chapter, we pulled in a lot of the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Plan. Actually, all of the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Plan are within the Comprehensive Plan draft. And that includes everything from the land use recommendations to the funding, governance, tenants' rights, and subsidy recommendations. With economic prosperity and opportunity, in that chapter, we've built in some additional focus on community wealth building alongside the existing focus on job training and job placement. And that chapter also contains support for economic development, both at the smaller scale and a larger scale to support the city in general. In the chapter called Environment, Climate, and Food Access, there is support for these ongoing efforts, which are the Climate Action Plan and the Rivanna River Corridor Plan. We haven't necessarily tried to get ahead of those plans and put recommendations that they might be developing, but we've included a strategy to incorporate those documents into the plan when they're ready. And that chapter also added a focus on food access, which we know is a key community priority, and for many really became clear during COVID, but we know that is something that people would like to see more focus on, including more locations for food, local food, such as gardens, but also things like just getting access to food locations, such as grocery stores that are affordable. Let's see, the last two, transportation prioritizes safe multimodal transportation throughout the city, especially where there's specific development nodes. And in the community facilities and services chapter, that chapter includes everything from community safety to parks and recreation to utilities. And so throughout that, we made some updates, including we heard a lot from the community in May 2020 about wanting to sort of re-envision how community safety works, including with the police department, thinking through how the community and the police department can both have a role in enhancing community safety. So we've added some recommendations around that, as well as emphasizing the infrastructure needs in each of the growth areas. So that was it may have felt long, but that was a very brief update on some of the changes there. And so we'd welcome you to dig into those chapters more and find out what's in them. And we'd love to get your feedback on those documents.
Jenny,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I wanted to highlight one question you may want to save for later, but I'll read it off now just in case it's pertinent for this time. Can you explain the shift in language for land use, for the land use chapter from urban design to urban form?
Yes, that's a good question. We, early on in discussions with staff, I believe came to the language of urban form because it is more of an outcome, where urban design is more of a process. And so we want to incorporate goals related to outcomes. It's a bit, there's a lot of, I can understand why it's a question you would have asked. There are strategies related to urban design in the chapter, but in general, again, the goal here is to work toward a future urban form that we've encapsulated a bit in the land use categories that Ron will go through in just a bit. But I believe that was the reason. Let's see, with that, I'll invite Ron to dig into the land use piece, and he'll start out with a bit of historic context around land use.
Yes, thank you, Jenny. As we begin to look to the future land use map, an important place to start is understanding the history. Charlottesville has had a very storied and long history. It was initially founded in 1762 and incorporated in 1888. Some of the primary elements that led to the early development of Charlottesville was the completion of the Virginia Central Railroad and UVA, which brought people to this area of the region, and of course led to the development of the city and areas around the city. The city was incorporated in 1888, as we know. That was post-Civil War and post-slavery. And as a result, just like many other communities across the country, that period ushered in an era of racial covenants and racial inequality. And we can begin to see that and see how that had impacted the city, not only at that time, but the impacts, ramifications can be seen on the ground today. The Mapping Cville project, which is a very interesting project that's taking place in the city, where they are mapping where racial covenants were historically located within the city. And these racial covenants really define where particularly Black citizens were able to live within the city, and these areas that had racial covenants prevented people who were Black from living in many areas of the city. So you can see this is one of the draft maps that organization was working through a few months ago there. It's a rather long process. There's a lot of parcels within Charlottesville, but this was a draft of their work. You can begin to see areas north of downtown, near the Venable area, north of Preston Avenue, particularly just between Preston and 250, and Emmett Street, in the Rugby area, and then down in some areas kind of southwest of the city around UVA, were areas that had a lot of properties that had these racial covenants associated with the land. So as a result, the African American community was not able to live there. And today, these communities remain largely white and not diverse. So that's something kind of interesting to note related to the evolution of the city. I will note that these racial covenants do not exist today. They're not enforced today, but it's important to recognize that, these laws did once exist, and they did help shape the development of the city, particularly around the demographic profile of different communities within the city. By 1929, the city developed its first zoning code, which, again, that was the first zoning code of the city, and it did allow for 2 units per property, which is something different, which is something very interesting, because as time went on, there was a movement more towards single family, 1 house per lot zoning. So we thought it was fairly interesting that back in 1929, there was historically zoning that would accommodate more density in some of these neighborhoods. Moving on into the 1950s, the city's comprehensive plan, the first comprehensive plan, was developed by 1958. This first comprehensive plan became infamous because it led to the urban renewal program, which many of us know led to the destruction or demise of communities such as Vinegar Hill, which were primarily African American neighborhoods, particularly around downtown, that were demolished to make way for more development of the downtown district. Even though it took place in the 1960s, there are residents who are alive and descendants of those communities that remember these actions of that time. And there's still some community hurt related to that. And so that's another, unfortunate action that had taken place in history that we could still see the effects and ramifications of today, even though that was more than 50 years ago. By the 1990s, the zoning map was updated again. And if you can recall, I talked about the 2 units per lot, the 1929 plan. By 1991, single family zoning broadened throughout the city. It also began to spark conversations around affordability and exclusion. Many saw that as, detrimental to the development of the city as far as affordable housing, less housing units, more expensive the housing becomes. So, many people saw that as an issue with the 1991 plan. And then fast forward to 2003, the current zoning code was adopted. And then by 2013, the current comprehensive plan, in which we're updating, was adopted. So that's kind of a brief whirlwind history of zoning and planning and community development within the city. Of course, there were many other small area plans, community plans, and such that were also developed within the city. But those major milestones in history really affected the development of the city over time. So let's fast forward to today. Charlottesville is a growing city. It has a population of over 50,000 people. However, it is quite compact, encompassing 10 square miles. So that's fairly compact for a city of this size. The city is one unified city, but many of you think of it as a series of neighborhoods and districts. The city has 19 neighborhood planning areas, you can see on this map here, and you also saw as part of the poll in the beginning of our presentation. Each neighborhood planning district is unique. They are in different areas of the city, so they're spatially contextual to each other. They vary in size, land uses. Some neighborhood districts have more commercial uses versus parks versus residential area. And then we touched a lot on the history. Again, some of these communities have had a storied history and evolution over time. And then they all vary based upon demographics as well. We know that the city is a very diverse place, and so is its neighborhoods. Neighborhoods include residential areas, of course, and this is a map that shows the different types of housing within the city. So you can see on this map, it's fairly colorful and it's very complex. And it begins to show you that many of these neighborhoods already have a mix of residential types within it. The light blue would be single family uses. You can see the majority of the parcels on the map are single family, but within that, you also have duplexes, apartments, condominiums, triplexes, and other different types of higher density housing types that sprinkle within all of these different neighborhoods. And we thought that was something very fascinating as we began to analyze the city and look to the existing land use patterns within the city, is that it's fairly diverse today. And you may not notice the diversity of the neighborhood, particularly by just driving by, because many of these land use types can take the form of a regular single family home that could be split into duplexes or other multi-unit development. So we thought that was a very interesting analysis of the city, showing that these neighborhoods are fairly diverse today. Speaking of diversity, again, we have a diverse demographic within the city. Many of the city's Black residents live south and west of downtown, areas such as Fifeville, Ridge Street, 10th and Page, Rose Hill, and then over to the east and Woolen Mills. And then the city also has a high Hispanic population, particularly concentrated along the Emmett Street corridor. And you can see, if you remember the racial covenant map, that is beginning to be reflected. Those parcels in red that were in the Locust Grove, Barracks, Rugby area, Venable, Lewis Mountain, some areas of Jefferson Park Avenue community. Those where the racial covenants were located. You can see on this demographic profile that even today, there's a distinction between where African Americans live in the city and where it's predominantly white. Diversity can reach further than just race. There's also economic or income-based diversity within the city. And you can see around the university areas, in particular, there are a higher concentration of lower income areas within that district, and also to the east city. Employment is very important. Charlottesville is a regional center, and you can see this is a map showing where concentrations of employment lie within the city. So the darker the color, the more employment activities that occur, and the lighter the color, the less employment activities occur. So you can see in many of the residential areas, north and south, as you would suspect, has less employment activity, but areas such as downtown, the UVA, West Main Street corridor, north along US 29, these are major employment areas, And there are also areas that include many of the city's amenities, such as shopping, dining, civic resources, and other activity areas that really make the city a special place and make it one where people visit. But we also, as we look to the employment and these activity centers within the city, we also need to keep in mind areas outside of the city, such as Pantops, to the south, the Fontaine Avenue Research Center area along JPA. US 29, as we all know, is a major commercial corridor that extends along 29, moving north of the city. So in this map on the lower left, we also map not only the employment centers of the city, but also the employment centers around the city as well. So context is very important as we look to the future land use map within the city. Transportation, how do people get around? We know that there are major vehicular corridors within the city. This map, the darker, the more intense the colors are, the more traffic, the lighter the colors, the less traffic. So you can see corridors like 250, Preston Avenue, 5th Street, High Street, JPA corridors. Major corridors are ones that currently have the heaviest traffic. There are also corridors that have a high degree of transit. Charlottesville is an interconnected place, not only connected by motor vehicles, but it has a robust bus system, as well as a pretty good pedestrian infrastructure, particularly around parks and schools. And so that's something that's very important as we think to the multimodal capacity of the city, as we think to the future land use map. I kind of touched on this, parks and open spaces. The city has many recreational amenities. The areas you see on the green on the map are major park spaces. The brown lines are trails and major pedestrian ways. So you can see the city is fairly connected, has a nice, robust system of parks and open spaces. We know that the city also has many environmental features. The city is not flat, it's very hilly. And you can see this is what we call a topo relief map, where you can see the shadows, which are the lower areas, and then the brighter areas, which are higher areas. So you can see the city is fairly topographically challenged. And along with the topography, the city has a lot of water resources. The Rivanna River is a major water resource on the east side of the city, and its tributaries, Moore's Creek, Meadows Creek, and the other tributaries that flow from the Rivanna River are part of the city's parks and open space system, and they are sensitive. So as we look to the future development of the city, we do need to keep in mind the environmental resources of the city as well. And again, I kind of touched on this with employment, but the urban ring, what has been coined, is the area around the periphery of Charlottesville. So all of this colored area is not within the city limits, but it's the area of development around the city. So the One Community Project was a planning exercise undertaken by the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County to look at land uses around the periphery of the city, and all of the different planning areas that lie around the periphery of the city, to make sure that the borders between Charlottesville and Albemarle County are unified in regards to land uses. So what we do in the city should naturally flow to the county, and what's going on in the county should naturally flow into the city as well. One thing, if you've been following the housing study, housing is very important. There's a great housing need in Charlottesville. Charlottesville is a city that continues to grow. However, there has been a lack of new construction of housing units within the city. And as I described earlier, Charlottesville is only 10 square miles. In fact, only 3% of the land area within the city is not developed. So as we think about the city cannot grow out, we need to think about how the city can grow up and densify and intensify in development in areas of the city that make sense so that we can increase the housing supply, which will in turn begin to improve housing affordability within the city, along with other policy measures called for within the housing plan. Previous and current planning efforts, the city has many planning documents related to the future visioning of the community, and we listed out many of them on the left side of the page. And don't worry, I won't go through every plan, but you can see there are a lot of plans, there's a lot of pieces that must come together to help we think of the future land use plan. We don't want to think of the future land use plan in isolation. We want to incorporate many of the ideas or the ideas for many of these plans. So we begin to unify all of these plans together and have them work together to create one unified future land use map. On the map to the right, you can see some of the larger major plans. Some of the most recent ones completed was the Cherry Avenue small area plan. There was a vision plan developed for the Star Hill community. The Rivanna River corridor study is one that's ongoing that looks to the Rivanna River corridor and the border between the county and the city. And also the master plan of the US 29 corridor, which was a joint planning effort between the city and the county. And many of you may be familiar with the strategic investment area located near the south end of downtown, which begins to envision future land uses for that particular district of the city. So that takes us into the draft future land use map. So before I get into the draft future land use map, I want to talk a little bit about the future land use map, or land use versus zoning. The comprehensive plan future land use map is a tool to set a vision for how the city will develop over the next 20 years into the long term. It is a guide that can be used in evaluating development proposals in the future for rezoning, but it is not a legally binding plan and is not legally required. So, it's a plan that is visionary, but it is not directly legally binding, which is different from zoning. Zoning is a legally binding set of ordinances that must be followed as part of any development process. And zoning will get into a lot more detail than what you would find in the future land use map. Again, a future land use map is a visionary document that kind of sets the overall vision of the community, but the zoning takes that map, takes that information, refines it down to create that regulatory document that gets into a lot more detail. For instance, you'll see when we walk through the future land use map categories, we have 9 key land use categories for development. Zoning, we have many more because it will begin to break those districts down into a finer grain. And that's where we can have a lot more detail to describe how that legal document is transitions and is developed as part of this. And I will also note that there is a zoning update as part of this project that will happen after the future land use process and after the comprehensive planning process is over. That'll be the next phase. So there will be much more refinement of the future land use recommendations that we'll discuss today. To kind of set the stage of how we look to the future land use map, we developed 9 key planning objectives. 1, we want to build upon the land use recommendations integrated in all of those different plans that I showed you all a few slides ago, particularly the more recent studies like the Affordable Housing Plan, the small area plans, and other completed and ongoing citywide studies. We want to look at this through an equity lens. We want to make sure that we're providing equitable opportunities for density increases through the entirety of the city, through all areas of the city. And also we want to enhance community services everywhere. We want to make sure that we have community services close to where people live. We want to increase density around community amenities such as shopping, employment centers, and transit. We want to create a walkable community, a community that not just relies on cars, but allows for flexibility in how people get around, and the amenities are directly accessible to the residents. We want to explore development of vacant and underutilized properties. Underutilized properties would be ones such as vacant shopping centers or low scale, perhaps shopping centers that are currently operable but can be transformed in the future to support more housing or additional community services. We want to maximize access to public spaces and schools. Again, going back to the notion of creating that walkable, bikeable, transit accessible community. Point 6, we want to establish correlation between city land uses, UVA, and the urban ring. Again, not only thinking about the city in isolation, but how it ties to the region and community resources such as UVA. Increasing access to transit. And then 8, protecting, preserving, and enhancing the natural and cultural resources of the city. Charlottesville is rich in natural resources, historic resources, and that's something that we need to recognize as we look to the future land use plan. And last but certainly not least, economic sustainability is very important. We want to create a city that has a wide range of commercial opportunities that can help support jobs and other additional community amenities that help make the city a great place to live.
Before Ron continues, I just want to note, I see there's been a couple hands that have popped up, and as with the Q&A, we will invite hands to be raised at the end of the presentation, and we'll be happy to take your questions at that time. So just wanted to let you know, if your hand's raised, we're not going to ignore it forever. We will invite you to speak later in the meeting. Thank you.
So this is a image of the draft future land use map, and I will say this map has had many iterations since March, and this is not the final map. We're going to take in all of the public engagement feedback that we're receiving. We're going to receive feedback tonight. There's going to be other opportunities for community engagement in the coming weeks, and we're going to compile that. And I would envision that this map will change and it'll refine, and it'll begin to reflect even more some of the comments that we're hearing, not only tonight, but into the future. So I do want to say that this is a draft plan. And you can see on the right, this is where we are today. This map shows all of the different land uses that we are proposing within the city. And to the left is the key. There are pretty much 9 key or core land use categories that are related to development within the city. And those range from the downtown core, urban mixed use nodes, urban mixed use corridors, business and technology mixed use, neighborhood mixed use nodes, neighborhood mixed use corridors, and then 3 different categories of residential development, which would include high, medium, and general residential uses. And we'll walk through the differences between those land use categories. But as an overview, this map begins to show how all of those different layers of land uses begin to overlay with each other. So let's start with residential. From the least intense down to the highest intense, we have a general residential category, which you can see in the light golden color. This residential area will support a range of housing types, scale within the context of existing single-family character. Many of these lighter areas are where we have existing single-family development. So we do want to recognize the opportunities, particularly those called for in the affordable housing plan, of increasing density in existing neighborhoods. So we want to talk a little bit about that and how we're approaching that. But we also, within this category, try to be sensitive to the existing character of those existing residential neighborhoods. We have medium intensity residential, which is the step up from the general residential category. These would include housing types such as row houses, townhouses, small multi-unit buildings. There could be 8 accessory dwelling units, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next slide. Again, making sure that we keep with the affordable housing plan goals by increasing affordability, increasing intensity within these areas. And then last but not least, we have a high intensity residential. These would be your apartment complexes, areas that could support apartment complexes and other higher intensity residential uses, which I'll show a couple of pictures of how that type of use may be illustrated. So this slide shows the spectrum of residential uses within the future land use map. The general residential category, which is kind of the lowest intensity residential, goes up to 3 dwelling units per lot. Right now, a lot of the areas that we're showing, as many areas that we're showing as general residential, are now zoned at least R1 or 1 unit per lot. This general residential category allows up to 3 units per lot. And I will say that when we get into zoning, we will be defining where, different unit per lot designations would occur within the city. So it won't be one blanket land use, but recognize that this category may include sites that have up to 3 dwelling units per lot. Moving up in intensity, we have the medium intensity residential, which range between 4 to 12 units per lot. And again, these are a couple of examples of that. We have row homes or townhouses. This is an example of a small apartment building that's integrated into an existing single family neighborhood. So you can see that those range of housing types are more intense than the general residential, where in this image to the left, you can see this is what we call an accessory dwelling unit, or a small housing unit that's detached from the main house that could be rented. So this is an example where it's over a garage, and it's also in a historic district as well. This is an example of a duplex, but again, moving into the more medium intensity, you have more dense, larger but house size development that can occur. And then we have our high intensity residential. This is actually a Google Earth snippet from near the 14th Street corridor near UVA, where you can see apartment buildings interspersed, different sizes, different scales, differences. I thought this was a good example of how high intensity residential development could occur. It isn't always these large, massive apartment complexes. It can occur in a much finer grain. And we think there's a lot of opportunity within that as well. As far as urban form, we think that all of these districts should be compatible with existing residential and historic neighborhood contexts. And the highest buildings should be accommodated where appropriate. And speaking of heights, the general residential category may range up to 3.5 stories. We think typically that height will be 2 to 2.5 stories, which is more in scale with existing residential neighborhoods. The medium intensity residential category may go up to 4.5 stories. We're thinking 3 to 3.5 stories may be the more typical height. And again, once we get into more detail of these districts, those heights and where the higher heights occur will be defined. And then high intensity residential up to 5 stories. You see a lot of 5-story apartment development throughout the city today, such as in this image. So we think that that would be the height expectation for that district. Next, we have mixed use nodes, and nodes are areas or concentrated areas of activity. We have neighborhood nodes, which these are compact neighborhood centers that encompass a mix of land uses arranged in smaller scale buildings, and they're compatible with existing surrounding residential areas. Then we have the more intensive urban mixed use nodes. These are more intensely developed in the neighborhood mixed use nodes, and they support a wide range of housing, employment, and commercial elements that help meet the city goals. And then of course we have downtown, which is one of the central hubs of the city. Here are a couple of examples of these types of districts. You can see on the left image, this is an example of a neighborhood mixed use node. Again, parking, the form of the development is that the parking is at the rear of the building where possible, so that you get as much walkable street environment in these locations as possible. You can see in this image, there's a range of housing types from apartments to condos, and also some commercial development mixed within this commercial center. There's articulation of the urban form. You have pitched roof, flat roofs. So you really want to create that diverse architectural character and form is what we're thinking for those neighborhood mixed use nodes. Urban mixed use nodes are, again, a step up with higher intensity development. They're much more urban. They incorporate public spaces and civic spaces, as you can see in that center image. And then downtown. Downtown is a fairly diverse neighborhood area today. And we could see that that will continue into the future. In all 3 of these different districts or types, we would encourage commercial employment and residential uses, and also encourage that vertical mixed use. And if you're not familiar with vertical mixed use, that's where you have commercial or office activities on the bottom floor. So you have a very active street, and then residential or office uses on the upper floors that not only help support the businesses that are on lower floors, but also create these more neighborhood districts. The form, again, we want to make sure that we're in keeping with the environmental and historic context within all of these districts and how these development areas relate to existing neighborhoods. And height is also important. The mixed use nodes, we're thinking that the heights will be up to 4 stories in these areas, up to 5 in larger areas that have room for more internal development. Mixed use nodes will range up to 5 to 8 stories and perhaps up to 10, where comprehensive goal plans are can be realized related to housing affordability and community wealth building. And then downtown, 2 to 6 stories. We know that today, many of those buildings range up to 10 stories, but there is more of a desire to have development within the 2 to 6 story range, but higher heights can be achieved if it's compatible with existing surrounding land uses, historic context, and if it accomplishes goals related to housing affordability and community wealth building as well. Last but not least, we also have corridors. So we have nodes, which are centers of activities within the city. And then we have corridors, areas that extends from these nodes to different areas of city. And they really become mixed use places that are more neighborhood oriented. So one, we have neighborhood mixed use corridors. Think of places like Cherry Avenue as a good example of a neighborhood mixed use corridor, which are areas that have a mix of land uses organized along the length of a corridor. And then we have urban mixed use corridors, very similar to the nodes. The urban mixed use corridors are higher intensity, which can further support employment, commercial, and civic activities of the city. And then also we have with this business and technology zones, your light industrial and production areas. You can think of places like your Harris Street corridor, your River Road area, your Market Street areas of the city that have a lot of those light industrial and production uses that we are incorporating as part of the plan. Again, similar to the other land use categories, we have some imagery that shows how some of these areas may develop. You can see here for the neighborhood mixed use corridor, the buildings are 2 to 3 floors in height. We will provide provisions up to 5 stories as part of the vision in areas where we have the depth to do so in the lots, or at key intersections where we want to emphasize placemaking as an opportunity. Urban mixed use corridors. This is an image from West Main Street. They're higher, so you can see it's higher buildings than in the neighborhood mixed use corridor. But we do like the urban form that begins to step the building down to the street and also step the building down to existing residential neighborhoods, which is important. And then we have our business and technology mixed use. This is where we have maker spaces. And what I mean by maker spaces are production areas such as signage and fencing and other production uses that is highly desired in the city. And that's something that's that has been important to the evolution of the city, and one that continues to be a major employment element of the city. We want to make sure that we still provide areas where those types of activities can occur. In all of these districts, we want to have a focus on making sure that these corridors relate to the existing neighborhoods, residential character, environmental character, and historic context. And then for the business and technology mixed use areas, paying close attention to reclamation and reuse of gray field sites. Many of these areas have historic industrial uses. So with redevelopment, we can retain those uses, but also provides an opportunity for revitalization of a lot of those properties for a healthier environment. I touched on heights. Neighborhood mixed use corridors average around 3 stories, but maybe up to 5 stories where we want to emphasize special placemaking. Urban mixed use corridors, typically 5 stories in height with 8 stories at key intersections. And then your business and technology mixed use areas can range up to 6 stories, again, supporting that light manufacturing, industrial, business uses, and also allowing for some residential uses on upper floors where appropriate. So that was an overview of the future land use map. And I encourage each of you to go online. We have an interactive map that Jenny's going to talk a little bit more about in the upcoming slides, to really get into the map and move around the map and take a closer look at where all these different land use designations occur. I wish I could walk through the whole map, but it would take the whole hour and a half plus some. But I think that was a good overview of what those categories are, what they mean, and how they were applied. As we think about development, there are other considerations that we must keep in mind. Height is very important. I did list off some initial heights to set the vision of how some of these development areas will formulate over time, but final heights will be defined in the zoning element of this work. So again, we are setting a vision, we are setting kind of an expectation of what the heights may be, but the final heights will be defined as part of that zoning element post future land use map and comprehensive plan. Historic districts are very important. As we met with stakeholders to date, historic districts have come up a number of times as one sensitive areas that we have to recognize within the future land use map. We know that there are going to be architectural controls that will define building setbacks, step backs, heights, limitations, buffers, and other historic architectural features as part of the zoning code. We're looking to defining where opportunities may exist for densification and intensification of land uses, recognizing that, especially in some of these historic districts, that there will be another element or additional element of architectural control. Environmental issues are very important. Things like critical slopes. I touched a little bit about on the topography of the city. It's very topographically challenged in many areas. So that's something that, we have to look to and make sure that we're not negatively impacting, particularly those critical waterways, such as the Ravenna River and the stream corridors, thinking about stormwater management and floodplains as well. And we also heard a lot about tree canopy, the need to retain as much tree canopy as we can, and looking to other means of replacement and adding to the existing tree canopy of the city. And then transportation safety is important as well. The city does have a transportation plan, the Streets That Work master plan, which was developed 2 or 3 years ago, which we did use as a basis of our land use thinking, is how we designated density throughout the city. But beyond that, transportation safety is important, and that's something that we want to emphasize in the comprehensive plan. So just to sum things up, we talked a little about the urban ring, the area around the city. We have thought about that, and you can see here on the map on the right, we overlaid the draft future land use map onto that urban ring area such that we can understand how our borders are marrying with the county. This is a comparison of the 2013 future land use map and the 2021 update, or at least the draft update at this point. You see they look very different. We have different land use categories than what was shown in the 2013 plan. So difficult to directly compare them apples to apples because they're actually apples and oranges. But we have begun to identify the distribution of land based on the land use categories in the 2013 plan and the 2021 plan, to begin to see how much mixed use, how much residential, business and technology land uses that we have designated within the city, and where those different land uses are different generally from the 2013 plan. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny to talk a little bit about changes between the March and May drafts.
Sure, just a few more slides and then we'll be happy to dive into the questions we've been getting. So we've gotten questions about what have we changed between the March 30th map that we talked about with the Planning Commission and what we're putting out now for public comment. So I just wanted to go through a few of those updates. One thing is we adjusted the colors. You'll see the colors look different on the two maps. That was to make them more readable. We realized that the purples looked more darker, more intense, and so we switched them with the pinks. So from the map on the left to the maps on the right, the urban mixed use nodes and corridors and the neighborhood mixed use nodes and corridors switched colors. We also changed the color of downtown to make it more clear, but we didn't change the sort of the description we were including with it. We, on a more substantial basis, if you look right around UVA, the JPA area, Lewis Mountain, I know we've seen some questions about Lewis Mountain in particular, and we are showing more intensity of residential uses now than we were showing in March, because we heard feedback from the Planning Commission in particular and others that given that UVA creates a large housing need in the city, it behooves both the university and the city to have more housing near the university, both for students, for employees, and others. So that was why we intensified those uses there. We've also looked at having more of these nodes throughout the city. Ron's been talking about them. And that was to address the priority we've heard that people want from many, that people want to have more walkable communities where you can find the services you need on a day-to-day basis. And these neighborhood scale nodes are one way that we can support that in the land use map. When we talked to the Planning Commission, as well as some others groups that we met with, we also heard an urge to see more greater density of residential uses throughout the city, particularly those places that are maybe more exclusive right now due to costs, or they maybe are largely single family, meaning that not everyone can afford to buy that type of house or to rent that type of house. So providing more opportunities for smaller units or just a range of housing units throughout the city. And so you'll see there was sort of an expansion of some of the medium density residential areas. If you look sort of to the northwest part of the city, as well as in North Downtown, it shifted a bit as well. One of the other noteworthy changes is the industrial areas. When we talked with the Planning Commission on in March, we had a designation called industrial mixed use. And then we've, for the current draft, we've reverted to the current 2013 land use designation, which calls it business and technology. So that it still supports industrial uses, light industrial uses, but it changes the name of it a bit to be consistent with the current land use plan. And we also adjusted the boundaries of those areas on the map. You can see, as Ron talked through previously, those business and technology areas, we have suggested that some of those areas might be good places to have some of these neighborhood nodes that we've talked about. So as they might look to change in the future, those would be good areas to consider ways to have more mixed use and housing development in the city. If you go to the next slide, Ron, one other thing we wanted to clarify was throughout this process, since last year, we've been talking about equity being a really important piece of this. And so we want to clarify some of the things we've been thinking about with that. So this plan really attempts to balance several different things. We're looking to provide more housing opportunities, including housing that's affordable at a range of levels, close to parks, schools, transit, services, jobs, places people want to be close to. Because oftentimes those are the places that are more inaccessible to folks due to cost. We're also looking at increasing the availability of housing, as I mentioned, in existing single-family neighborhoods that have historically had exclusionary zoning or which contain just few non-single-family housing options now, which again makes them less accessible for folks. We also want to minimize at the same time, potential community disruption and displacement pressures, particularly in lower income neighborhoods or communities that have experienced displacement previously. And that's not something we can only do with the land use map. That requires supporting policies, funding, programs, initiatives. And you can see in the comprehensive plan chapter, particularly the land use piece and the housing chapter, how we're putting forth some recommendations around that. We also want to support community wealth building through potential smaller scale housing that people can buy, and also supporting that with funding and other programs to support home ownership. So that's another thing we're trying to balance with this future land use map. Again, the land use policies cannot do any of these things on their own. We can't have a fully equitable sort of land use program unless the land use map is paired with other programs to ensure affordability and protections for communities. Just to reiterate, we won't go through this whole slide, but it's in the PDF if you would like to see it on the website. On the left, you can see the Affordable Housing Plan land use recommendations. They were around multifamily housing, soft density, which includes things like duplexes and triplexes and ADUs. There were recommendations about not only having more ADUs, but allowing more flexibility in how they are permitted, and also having requirements for affordability. And then the other land use recommendation was around inclusionary zoning. So these are all things that, as we've talked through them tonight, you can see we've tried to address on the map where we can. But again, these need to be tied to policies and programs in the comprehensive plan and as we move forward in other ways. For example, this inclusionary zoning policy is something we'll be considering as we rewrite the zoning ordinance in the next step. So I'll invite you to dig into the details of those on the website. But for now, next steps. So we will get to all of your questions in just a second, but we want to hear from you in other ways. So Ron, thank you. So we invite you to go to this website, cvilleplans-together.com/engage3. You can, there's a translate function. You can translate to Spanish or several other languages. And we'd invite you to go there and share your feedback in a variety of ways. There's a comment form, there's an interactive map where you can zoom in and out, you can search for your address or other addresses of interest, and then leave a little note of a comment. You can also call the phone line and leave a brief message with some comments if you'd prefer to do that, or send us an email. And our email will be on the next slide. But before we go there, I just want to note, we'd also love to see you at an event. And obviously you're here at a webinar, which is great. There's another webinar on May 25th at the same time. We'll be recording and posting both of those. But we also will be in town. We were at the park on Saturday at Riverside Park. And we will be back in town this weekend for at least 3 events, likely a couple more that will come up. Friday we'll be at Reed's Market in the parking lot from 1 to 3. And then on Saturday, we'll be at Ix Art Park for the farmers market from 8 to noon. And then we'll be at Jefferson School later in the afternoon. So we'd invite you to stop by and talk with us. We'll have a big version of the map. We'd be happy to get your comments there in person. But please help us. I'm glad there's so many of you on the line tonight. For those of you, I'm not sure if you all can see how many people we're on, but I think our maximum earlier today was at maybe 75 or 80. So a lot of folks tuned in tonight. But we'd invite you to share this with others as well to ask them to get involved. But with that being said, we'd love to address some of your questions. And so if you do want to say your question out loud, feel free to raise your hand. But first, we're going to go through some of the Q&A box here. Let's see. And Latoya, I can probably just go through some of these if that works for you.
That's fine.
Great. So let's see here. It looks like there was a question about not including Belmont in our survey. I think, I'm not sure if this was in reference to the poll we had at the beginning of the webinar or the survey that's currently available in the comment form. If it was for the poll, we did sort of group the neighborhoods together because of the limit on the options for Zoom. So it might have been sort of lost in there, but we certainly, see Belmont as a, just as with the others, is a very important part of the city. So we certainly do include that in our list of neighborhoods. Let's see, there's a question from Mr. Bill Emery. Can we direct you toward a map that shows the location and number of affordable housing units in the city? And I would say there is not a current, map of all affordable units in the city that I'm aware of. We often look at the tax assessment value is one way to look at how sort of affordable the housing landscape is. But I'm not sure if you're referring to subsidized housing units. I believe that is a map that should be available. We'd be happy to look into that, but we don't currently have one that we can pull up. Let's see here. There's a question about have we as consultants had boots on the ground to see at street level how the changes we're proposing will change the look and feel of the neighborhoods affected? And yes, we love Charlottesville. We've been in Charlottesville quite often, less often than we would have had there not been a pandemic going on, of course, but we've been around and fully understand, and we're glad that people have raised potential concerns in your neighborhoods. You all have a much deeper understanding than we do, but yes, we have been around, and we understand that looking at these potential changes for the future can be overwhelming, and may be concerning, but we have built into the recommendations a requirement to consider the existing neighborhood context of where, for example, if we're looking at a neighborhood node, we've built in that the zoning changes that eventually come for these areas need to take into account the context. So if the neighborhood node is within an area with, for example, 2-story homes, there might be a requirement that it can't go above a certain height so that it's not towering over the neighboring area. We want it to be in a comfortable sort of urban form. Let's see, I'm going to answer, there was a question about how is affordable housing defined? And if you look at the affordable housing plan, it's posted on the website. And there are a variety of strategies in there for various housing levels. For example, there's a recommendation to have a set of funding every year, and that has been broken down into a certain amount for, I believe it's up to 50% area median income and 80%. It's broken down in a certain way. But if you look at that plan, there are strategies across the spectrum, and we have, so there's not one affordability level that we've planned for. We're trying to incorporate a range of affordability. Excuse me. Let's see. There's a question about how were borders between different high intensity, medium, and general residential areas, how is that decided in a historic overlay district? Will it put existing historic structures, contributing structures at risk? And why have we expanded the high intensity designation to cover older historic residential units in the Venable neighborhood? So there's a few questions in there. So one is that with regard to the historic properties, we know that historic properties are a very important part of the fabric of Charlottesville. History in general is an important part of the city. And so we have proposed potential future land uses that would support retaining and land uses and policies that would support retaining these structures and maintaining the guidelines around them in historic areas. We do not want to put anything at risk to being torn down. Any changes that happen within those structures themselves, if the use is changing, for example, if they might potentially allow split it up into several units, that would still need to follow any guidelines about the exterior of the structure that are in place. In terms of why high intensity designation was expanded to cover additional areas in the Venable neighborhood, I believe, and Ron, please correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that change was made to make it more of a continuous area over there, recognizing that it is already an area with a lot of existing high intensity residential, and it is an area where, right near the university, wanting to have more of a continuity of land use in that area. Is that right, Ron?
Yeah, that's right. And yes, we expanded that area to make it more of one cohesive district. And again, that high intensity residential area includes a range of unit. There's already a mix of different scales of apartments and higher intensity residential embedded within the fabric of that area. So that designation certainly keeps in the spirit of what's on the ground there today, with the mix of student housing and other apartment development within that district.
Thanks, Ron. Let's see, there was a question about whether we considered identifying an ideal site in each neighborhood for sort of a signature apartment building. And I would say, no, we did not get down to that level of detail, but we did try to provide opportunities in all neighborhoods to have a range of these housing options, including some apartment living. And one of the reasons, there are many reasons for that, and we've talked about affordability, but it also plays into allowing options for people over time. As we all get older, we might not want to always be living in a larger home. We might want to have some options nearby where we can live in a smaller unit, maybe not have as much upkeep. And so allowing that range of housing options can really support people in a variety of ways. So it went a little beyond the question you asked, but I hope I answered your question as well. There's a question about what types of commercial uses are envisioned for areas that are designated as neighborhood mixed use corridor, medium intensity residential, those types of places. You know, are we expecting drive-through fast food restaurants, bars, restaurants, etc.? And what's the potential sort of traffic impact of that? And so that's a great question. Right now, we have not explicitly laid out a list of allowable uses. We envision things that really activate the street. For example, shops, restaurants, I believe would be something we'd envision with that. The zoning will get into more details about what can be, can happen in each of the zoning districts. And zoning will also get into details about parking and what that might look like. We have suggested in the comprehensive plan that in order to meet some of these urban form goals and have, walkability, there might need to be adjustments to parking, and while trying to protect those existing residential neighborhoods from having a lot of overflow traffic. So, the intent is not to be inconsistent with current residential character, as you note, they may be, but to allow a scale of uses that would be, consistent with residential character and also provide additional services and amenities that neighborhoods could use. Let's see here. There's a question about have we reached out to the university to see if they can help by housing more of their students on the grounds? And that's a great question. The university currently has an initiative to, the name of it is escaping me, unfortunately, but they have an initiative to study ways that they can provide more housing, affordable housing within the city in general. And they're also looking at ways to house more students on ground. So the university has a program ongoing now. And so we have coordinated with the university. We've met with them several times throughout this process, and we have a representative from the Office of the Architect on our steering committee. So we'll continue coordinating with them, but they do have their own existing effort as well. Let's see here. Right. Sorry, lots of good questions here. I'm trying to make sure we get through. Let's see. There's a question about why is Lewis Mountain not listed as general residential when that's what we are right now. This map is envisioning the future of land use. So in a lot of places in the city, I think what we're showing on the future land use map is not directly aligned with what the uses are on the ground right now, but are looking at potential for the future. We certainly recognize Lewis Mountain, like many places in the city, does have a lot of historic properties. And as we mentioned earlier, there are existing protections and guidelines around those properties that would still be in place. But recognizing the location of Lewis Mountain adjacent to the university in particular, we felt it was appropriate to potentially allow for more residential uses there. Let's see here. So there's a question about when we're looking at increased density and expanding, excuse me, misreading this question. How do we recommend that the city sort of take into account what is already in a place, and what that means for what can realistically happen in a 20-year period? The question in particular was raised for, let's see, an area on the 1400 block of Rugby Avenue, for example. And so when Ron was going through the presentation earlier, he noted that the recommendation is that there are, that when we get to the zoning, there are requirements built in to ensure that the heights and other forms of these different uses respond to the existing character of the neighborhood. And so even though some of the, we say up to a certain number of stories, it would depend on what's already there. Like you said, we do recommend that the city take into account what's already built on the ground when looking at the regulations here. let's see, there's a note about, I may have missed when I was doing the summary of the changes since March. We did look at adding additional potential uses to the Greenbrier neighborhood, including a neighborhood mixed use node and some additional medium intensity residential. And we did that in order to address the goal that we had to provide more housing options throughout the city, as well as looking at those ways to have those sort of complete communities throughout the city. And so the mixed use areas are intended to provide some potential for that mix of uses that people might want to have in their neighborhood to be walkable. And the medium intensity residential, recognizes that right now there may not be a lot of opportunities to have for folks to live in Greenbrier, but by allowing the development of, for example, smaller units, that might make it more accessible to folks. Let's see here. Let's see, there's a question about if we can explain the rationale or decision-making that led to the changes made in the medium intensity residential between the March and May plans. Ron, do you want to go back to that comparison slide for a second? So I did go through a few of the adjustments earlier, I described a few of the rationales for this. I think maybe what I did not speak to may have been North Downtown and Locust Grove. So just to speak to that to a second, we originally showed Locust Avenue as medium intensity residential, as well as medium intensity residential around the park up there. And after speaking with the Planning Commission and some others, including looking at historic preservation, historic districts in the area, we have readjusted the medium intensity residential in that North Downtown and Locust area to still provide opportunities in North Downtown and in Locust Avenue, or excuse me, Locust Grove. But we have pulled it off of directly along those historic district areas, even though, as we've noted, we believe it's certainly feasible to address these housing goals within the historic districts. But we have shifted it to within the middle of those in North Downtown, for example, as a way to provide that potential mix of housing options in an area where it does not right now have a lot of non-single family housing options. I think I spoke about some of the other changes to the medium intensity residential earlier. Again, we were trying to expand it throughout the city to provide some of those options more thoroughly in places that we had not shown them in March. Let's see here. Latoya, do you think we should take a couple of hand-raised questions and then go back to the Q&A? Would that work?
Sure, that's fine. So let me go in order of the list that I have. So first, we'll go with Bill Emery. So
and
Bill,
I should note, I'm going to, just as the city often does with meetings, we do have a timer we can pull up if that would be useful. Or maybe we will just say we would recommend that you keep within sort of about a 3-minute maximum for your comments.
All right, so Bill, I'm going to give you access to talk.
Thank you so much, Latoya. I wanted to just circle back to my question about whether there was a map available of existing affordable houses. I just wanted to frame it like if I was going to ride a bicycle from here to Oregon, I would want to know where the existing bike trails were to facilitate, the ride and just make it easier. And I realize you guys are in a pretty difficult situation that you came into a town that was several years late on their comprehensive planning goals, and that it's really pretty thorny. But it just makes so much sense to know where the existing affordable housing is. And, and you could do it by the 19 planning areas, any number of ways you could do it, but I would encourage you to embarrass the city and ask them with their very active housing advisory committee and their very knowledgeable GIS department to please provide you with the data necessary for a map that shows supported affordable housing. And then it would be really great if you go around town and also find out what other kind of affordable housing, like the house next door to me rents for $400, but I don't think it's on a map. If there's any way that you could check with landlords and find out, what exists that is affordable already, it would be great to, we could have a goal. How many, units do we need? How many units do we have? Where are they? It would inform the whole process, as it seems that affordable housing is the major process that's that is driving this comprehensive plan. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. And I'll note, I believe there is a map of the existing supported units, or at least several, maybe not an entire, all of the existing sort of subsidized units, but we should be able to get a map that represents some of that. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you.
All right, and give me 1 second. Next, Elizabeth Sloan. Give me 1 moment. Elizabeth, you should be able to unmute yourself.
My main question is more, I guess, a statement. I guess I'd just like to repeat, I have it written down. Would you all be willing, or would the city be willing to create a 3-dimensional model that the citizens of Charlottesville could look at and actually understand, as opposed to a colored map, which is very abstract for a person who doesn't have an architectural or urban planning degree?
Well, at this point, because we have a range of sort of allowable heights or forms, that would not be something that would be really feasible to create. Once we get to the zoning phase, we'll be looking at more specific guidelines around what's allowable on sites, and it may be more feasible to potentially develop something that could show some potential form in that way. But for the land use map,
I actually, I think you're incorrect about that. I think you could have a variety of images that could overlay. It could show, with building modeling techniques, you could show how it could go from 4 units to 12 units in what is now a residential neighborhood. So I do think that you could actually put something together that could share in a graphic sense that people could really wrap their minds around.
Okay, well, we will
just throwing it out there.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly appreciate the notion that not everyone it feels a land use map is very intuitive, so completely understand that. And to clarify, I was not saying that's something we might definitely do during the zoning. It's just something that might be more appropriate once we've got some specific guidelines. But we will look at ways to make the proposed land use map more accessible in terms of visuals.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. And Latoya, I know we have 27 more questions in the Q&A. We've got a couple more hands raised. So recognizing we will not get through all the Q&A tonight and whatnot, I would suggest that we go through the final hands that are raised now. And then we will commit to responding to the Q&A within the next week or so. Does that work?
Sure. So next, Crystal Passmore, 1 second. And you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I guess the question I have is, there are a couple areas that were historically white and racistly covenanted that are now currently very white. And those areas seem to still be like very low density on your map. And I think it's hard to balance. This was racist zoning, and that means it was white and very low density, with let's keep the integrity of the neighborhood. because if the integrity of the neighborhood is like white and single family, that's a hard place to be in. But I think we could push for more housing in these areas that are, like you guys have talked about, they're very close to downtown, they're very close to jobs. I'm talking specifically about like Northern Belmont, North Downtown, north of Rose Hill, Rugby areas. These areas seem like, what are you prioritizing when you say like character of the neighborhood versus like these had historically bad zonings? Thank you. Yeah, buddy.
Sure, thanks. So we, in some of the areas that we have looked at potential increases in those areas we've identified, we've concentrated on having potential increased intensity along corridors to support for example, the transit priorities we've identified. And so in that case, that might be why we're showing more intensity along the corridor as opposed to within some of the neighborhoods themselves, because having more intensity along corridor can better support those infrastructure improvements. But I hear what you're saying about, when we talk about taking existing neighborhoods into account when we're allowing a certain height, for example, how do we take into account these potential sort of racist covenants or other existing or previously existing conditions? And I think that's something I need to grapple with a bit more before we can fully answer. Ram, is there anything you would add to respond to that?
Yeah, I think one of the big changes that we're implementing, and I'll go back up to the residential slide, is in this general residential. It is a light yellow, but we are allowing for some significant increases in intensity there. Most of those areas have R1 zoning, which is one single family house per lot. This plan would allow up to 3 units per lot. I mean, that's the potential for some of these areas to have 3 times the number of housing units in them. So I think that light color may be misleading for some folks, and that it's light, it's super low intensity, but we are across the board allowing for more intensity in those general residential areas that could be up to 3 units per lot instead of just 1.
Thanks, Ron. I think that's an important point to note. Let's see, I know we have 2 more hands raised, so we will address those 2 questions. And Ron, if you want to go back to the last slide, just as a reminder, we have several other opportunities for you all to submit comments. So we look forward to hearing from you in those ways as well. But Latoya, if you want to unmute the others.
Sure, Peter Gray will be next. And Peter, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So my understanding of the process so far is that the March map that you produced was the result of your considered analysis and recommendations. And I heard somebody on the webinar today describe receiving feedback from the city that led to changes in that map to the one that we're looking at right now. One of the changes that I think is alarming a lot of residential neighborhoods is the increased density to a medium usage along a lot of major corridors. And that seems to be a big change for a lot of residential neighborhoods since the March map. Could you please give us the names of the people that gave you the feedback from the city to do this? Was it council? Was it a particular department of the city? Can you just please be very specific so we'll know who we can take this up with?
Thank you for your question, Peter. So it was the March 30th Planning Commission meeting was when we discussed this with the Planning Commission. And I will say the direction that we received at that point was to look at places to address sort of this equity component that's been an important running theme of this process. And when it comes to the land use map, that one of the things we're looking at with that is how we can allow for allow potential greater intensity of uses, of residential uses in these neighborhoods that don't right now have those. And so we took that input, and we, as I mentioned, we have looked at the corridors as a way to bring that into some neighborhoods that don't currently have these potential higher density uses, because in doing that, we also support not only allowing different housing options in these neighborhoods, but also supporting increased transit, bikeability, walkability improvements in these areas, and supporting other objectives that we've identified as well. So I would say we received direction to look at ways to bring increased density of residential into different neighborhoods, but we took that and put it along the corridors.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments on this. And I think it's pretty clear that for anyone who's on this call, that there needs to be feedback to the Planning Commission for in some way overriding the considered recommendations of the firm that's producing this land use map. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Peter. And, we will be summarizing, as we have for the previous two phases of engagement. We'll be summarizing everything we've heard, and we'll be sharing that with the general community as well as with the Planning Commission.
All right, and our last person for the evening will be Sarah Lehman. Sarah, 1 second.
Great. Ron,
All right, you should be able to.
That last slide.
Yeah.
Sarah, you should be off of mute.
Great, thanks for taking my question. This is actually Sarah's husband. Building off of Peter's question and your response about much of the changes in land use happening along the corridors, it seems like one notable exception to that is Lewis Mountain Road neighborhood. And many of the changes happen to be in the inner streets or the neighborhood streets. I was wondering if you could speak to some of those decisions. That seems to be a rather significant departure from the decisions that are made for several of the other neighborhoods surrounding the university. And if you could speak to the decision behind that, as well as steps that you would recommend that residents in the neighborhood take in order to voice their fairly significant concerns about that change. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. And so you're right. As I noted, we did in the March version of the map, when we shared it with the Planning Commission, it's with the exception sort of along the Ivy corridor, it was largely general residential, which is the lowest intensity residential. And then in speaking with the Planning Commission and in looking at revisions to the map, we're considering the areas around UVA as a unique case, given the proximity to the university and the potential housing pressures that the university, that kind of come with the university. And so we, as you may have seen, we also increased the potential density of residential along JPA to the highest density residential. And then Lewis Mountain, recognizing the proximity to the university there, that was why we increased the potential residential to meet the medium intensity. So it was, you're right, it's that's different than the corridors we mentioned earlier, but the reasoning was considering this area around UVA as a unique case within the city. So you also asked what you should do if you want to submit comments and make your voice heard. And so we've got the website listed here, cvilleplans-together.com/engage3. And if you go there, you will be able to scroll down and you can see a link to view the comprehensive plan chapters as well as the land use map. And then if you keep scrolling, you can see any upcoming opportunities that are here. And so one thing you could do is come out to the pop-up events that we described. Ron, if you want to go up to the previous slide. Again, we'll be in town on Friday and Saturday. And we'd be happy to take your comments there. There's also a comment form on the website, as well as the interactive map. And so those are both places where you can submit your feedback. There is an option on there to submit demographic information, including where you live. And so I'd encourage you to include that in your response. And you can also call the phone line and leave a message, or you can send us an email, which is engage@cvilleplans-together.com. So we will be taking everything we're hearing, and we will be compiling the comments, both in a summarized form and in a sort of anonymized, more full way in an appendix. And we will share that with the community and with the Planning Commission. We've already got a work session, I believe, scheduled with Planning Commission for later in June to share feedback and talk about potential ways to incorporate it. So would encourage everyone to, we'll take into account the questions and comments submitted on the Q&A on the webinars, as well as spoken questions and comments. So any of you who submitted comments in the Q&A, please note, I know we're not going to get through all of them. So we will, again, respond to those and include them in the summary. So that being said, we're going to close out. I know we're after 7:30, but we will be making a recording of this available on the website. And so please feel free to view that and let others know about the other upcoming webinar opportunity, as well as the pop-ups. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you coming out, and we hope to see you soon, and please submit comments. Thank you.